The forest was unlike anything he had ever seen. The trees towered above him, their trunks thick and gnarled, their leaves shimmering with an otherworldly glow. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something sweet, almost like honey. He had been walking for hours, or was it days? Time seemed to blur in this place. His feet ached, his throat was dry, and his mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. How had he ended up here? He couldn't remember. All he knew was that he was lost, completely and utterly lost. He stumbled forward, his boots sinking into the soft, moss-covered ground. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, a labyrinth of shadows and light. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the forest itself was trying to slow him down. He paused for a moment, leaning against a tree to catch his breath. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced with questions. Where was he? How had he gotten here? And why did it feel like he was being watched? That's when he heard it, a sound that sent a chill down his spine. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder with each passing second. It was a song, haunting and beautiful, carried on the wind. He turned his head, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The melody was unlike anything he had ever heard, filled with notes that seemed to vibrate deep within his soul. Before he could decide whether to run toward the sound or away from it, he saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, tall and graceful, their movements almost hypnotic. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. They couldn't be real. But as they drew closer, he realized they were very real, and they were unlike anyone he had ever seen. The women were giants, standing at least 8 feet tall, their bodies strong and lithe. Their skin glowed faintly, as if lit from within, and their hair cascaded down their backs in waves of silver and gold. They wore simple garments made of woven leaves and vines, but they moved with a regal grace that made them seem like queens of the forest. Their eyes, large and luminous, locked onto his, and he felt a strange mix of awe and fear. One of the women stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. She tilted her head, studying him with a curious expression. He wanted to speak, to ask who they were and what they wanted, but his voice caught in his throat. The woman reached out, her hand hovering just inches from his face. Her touch was warm, almost electric, and he felt a jolt of energy course through his body. The other women began to circle him, their song growing louder, more intense. He could feel the vibrations in the air, in the ground beneath his feet. It was as if the forest itself was alive, responding to their presence. He tried to back away, but his body wouldn't obey. He was frozen in place, his mind racing with questions and fears. The woman who had touched him spoke, her voice low and melodic. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear, she was asking him something. He shook his head, trying to convey that he didn't understand, but she only smiled. It was a kind smile, but there was something in her eyes that made him uneasy. She gestured for him to follow her, and the other women fell in line behind her. He hesitated, his instinct screaming at him to run, to get as far away from these strange beings as possible. But something held him back. Maybe it was the way they looked at him, as if they had been waiting for him. Or maybe it was the strange sense of calm that washed over him whenever they were near. Whatever it was, he found himself following them, his feet moving almost of their own accord. The forest seemed to part for them, the trees shifting to create a path. The women led him deeper into the woods, their song filling the air. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being led to something important, something life-changing. But what? And why him? As they walked, he noticed strange symbols carved into the trees, glowing faintly in the dim light. The symbols seemed to pulse in time with the women's song, as if they were part of some ancient ritual. He wanted to ask about them, but he knew he wouldn't get an answer. Not yet, at least. Finally, they reached a clearing. In the center stood a massive stone altar, covered in intricate carvings and glowing with the same energy as the symbols on the trees. The women stopped, forming a circle around the altar. The lead woman turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and desperation. She gestured toward the altar, and he understood, this was where he was meant to be. But why? What did they want from him? And what would happen if he refused? Before he could think of a way to escape, the women began to chant, their voices rising in harmony. The air around him seemed to hum with energy, and he felt a strange pull, as if the altar was calling to him. He took a step forward, then another, until he was standing in front of the altar. The women's chanting grew louder, more urgent, and he felt a surge of power course through his body. He didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear, his life would never be the same. The chanting stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The man stood frozen in front of the altar, his heart pounding in his chest. The women watched him intently, their luminous eyes filled with a mixture of hope and desperation. He could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him, but he still had no idea what they wanted from him. The lead woman stepped forward, her movements graceful and deliberate. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and reassuring. Then she pointed to the altar and gestured for him to sit. He hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to run, but something in her eyes made him stay. There was a kindness there, a vulnerability that he hadn't noticed before. Slowly, he sat down on the edge of the altar, his legs trembling beneath him. The woman knelt in front of him, her gaze steady. She began to speak, her voice soft and melodic. He couldn't understand the words, but he could sense the emotion behind them, sadness, longing, and a flicker of hope. She reached into a pouch at her side and pulled out a small, glowing crystal. Holding it up, she gestured to the altar and then to him, as if trying to explain something important. He shook his head, frustrated. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The woman paused, studying his face. Then she placed the crystal in his hand and closed his fingers around it. The moment his skin touched the crystal, a jolt of energy shot through him, and his vision blurred. Images flashed before his eyes, a thriving village, filled with laughter and life, a sudden darkness that swept through the land, the men of the tribe vanishing one by one, leaving the women alone and desperate. The images came faster and faster, overwhelming him, until he felt like he was drowning in them. When the visions finally stopped, he was gasping for breath, his body trembling. The woman was still kneeling in front of him, her expression filled with sympathy. She placed a hand on his chest, over his heart, and then pointed to the crystal in his hand. He understood now. The crystal was a conduit, a way for her to show him the tribe's story. And the story was one of loss and survival. The tribe had once been strong and prosperous, their village a beacon of light in the forest. But something had gone wrong. A darkness had crept into their land, stealing their men and leaving the women to fend for themselves. They had searched for answers, for a way to bring their men back, but they had found nothing. Until now. Until him. The woman pointed to him again, her eyes pleading. He was their hope, their chance to rebuild what had been lost. But why him? What made him so special? He wanted to ask, but he knew he wouldn't get an answer. Not yet, at least. The other women began to gather around him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and hope. One of them reached out and touched his arm, her fingers brushing against his skin. He felt a strange warmth spread through his body, a sense of connection that he couldn't explain. It was as if they were welcoming him into their family, their tribe. But he still didn't know what they expected of him. Did they want him to stay with them? To help them rebuild their village? Or was there something more, something he wasn't ready to face? The lead woman stood and gestured for him to follow her. He hesitated for a moment, then stood and followed her out of the clearing. The other women fell in line behind them, their footsteps silent on the soft forest floor. They walked for what felt like hours, the forest growing darker and more mysterious with each step. Finally, they reached a hidden village, nestled in the heart of the forest. The village was unlike anything he had ever seen. The houses were built into the trees, their walls made of woven branches and leaves. Glowing crystals hung from the rooftops, casting a soft, ethereal light over the village. The air was filled with the scent of flowers and the sound of running water. It was beautiful, but there was an undercurrent of sadness, a sense of something missing. The women led him to the center of the village, where a large tree stood, its branches stretching high into the sky. The tree was covered in the same glowing symbols he had seen in the forest, and its trunk pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light. The lead woman placed a hand on the tree and closed her eyes, as if communing with it. Then she turned to him and gestured for him to do the same. He hesitated, then placed his hand on the tree. The moment his skin touched the bark, he felt a surge of energy, a connection to something ancient and powerful. Images flashed before his eyes again, this time, of the tree's history. He saw the tribe's men gathered around it, their hands pressed against its trunk, their faces filled with determination. He saw the darkness creeping in, stealing them away one by one. And he saw the women, left behind, their hands pressed against the tree as they prayed for a miracle. When the visions faded, he pulled his hand away, his mind reeling. The tree was more than just a tree, it was the heart of the tribe, the source of their power. And now, it was dying. The women needed him to help them save it, to restore the balance that had been lost. But how? He was just a man, lost and alone in a strange world. What could he possibly do to help them? The lead woman seemed to sense his doubts. She placed a hand on his chest again, over his heart, and then pointed to the tree. Her message was clear: he had the power to help them, if only he believed in himself. He looked around at the women, their faces filled with hope and determination. They had been through so much, had lost so much, and yet they still had the strength to keep going. How could he turn his back on them? How could he walk away when they needed him? How could he walk away when they needed him? But the thought of staying, of taking on such a huge responsibility, terrified him. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even sure he could survive in this strange, alien world. And yet, as he looked into the lead woman's eyes, he felt something stir within him, a spark of courage, a flicker of hope. Maybe he didn't have all the answers. Maybe he didn't even know what he was doing. But he couldn't just walk away. Not now. Not when they needed him. He took a deep breath and nodded. "I'll help you," he said, his voice steady. "I'll do whatever I can." The woman smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. She placed a hand on his shoulder and squeezed gently, as if to say thank you. Then she turned and led him deeper into the village, toward the tree and the unknown future that awaited him. The village was alive with activity. The women moved with purpose, their movements fluid and synchronized, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. They gathered around the great tree, their hands glowing faintly as they touched its bark. The air was thick with anticipation, and the man could feel the energy building, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground and into his bones. He stood at the edge of the clearing, watching as the women prepared for the ritual. They had dressed him in ceremonial garments, a tunic made of woven leaves and vines, and a necklace of glowing crystals that pulsed in time with the tree's light. He felt out of place, like an intruder in a sacred space, but the women treated him with reverence, their eyes filled with hope and gratitude. The lead woman approached him, her expression serious. She took his hand and led him to the center of the clearing, where the tree's roots twisted and curled into a natural platform. The other women formed a circle around them, their voices rising in a haunting melody. The song was different this time, deeper, more intense, filled with a raw emotion that sent shivers down his spine. The woman gestured for him to step onto the platform. He hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. The platform was covered in glowing symbols, their light shifting and swirling like liquid. He could feel the energy radiating from it, a power that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. He looked at the woman, searching for reassurance, but her expression was unreadable. She simply nodded, her eyes urging him to trust her. Taking a deep breath, he stepped onto the platform. The moment his feet touched the glowing symbols, a surge of energy shot through him, so intense that it nearly knocked him off his feet. He gasped, his vision blurring as the world around him seemed to shift and warp. The women's song grew louder, their voices blending into a single, powerful note that resonated deep within him. The lead woman stepped onto the platform with him, her movements slow and deliberate. She placed her hands on his shoulders and began to chant, her voice low and rhythmic. The other women joined in, their voices rising and falling in perfect harmony. The air around them seemed to shimmer, as if the very fabric of reality was bending to their will. The man felt a strange sensation spreading through his body, a warmth that started in his chest and radiated outward. It was as if the energy from the platform and the women's song was flowing into him, filling him with a power he couldn't comprehend. His mind raced with questions, but he couldn't speak, couldn't move. He was frozen in place, caught in the grip of the ritual. The lead woman stepped back, her hands still raised. She gestured to the tree, and the man felt a sudden pull, as if the tree was calling to him. He turned to face it, his eyes drawn to the glowing symbols on its trunk. They pulsed in time with the women's song, their light growing brighter with each passing moment. The woman placed a hand on his back and gently pushed him forward. He stumbled toward the tree, his legs moving of their own accord. As he approached, the symbols began to shift, their patterns rearranging themselves into a new design. He reached out, his hand trembling, and pressed his palm against the tree's bark. The moment his skin touched the tree, the world around him disappeared. He was no longer in the village, no longer standing on the platform. He was somewhere else, a place of light and shadow, where time and space seemed to bend and twist. Images flashed before his eyes, faster and faster, until he could no longer tell where one ended and the next began. He saw the tribes past, their men gathered around the tree, their hands pressed against its trunk as they channeled its energy. He saw the darkness creeping in, a shadowy force that consumed everything in its path. He saw the men vanish, one by one, their faces filled with fear and determination. And he saw the women, left behind, their hands pressed against the tree as they prayed for a miracle. The visions shifted, showing him the future, a future where the tree withered and died, its light fading into nothingness. The village fell into ruin, the women scattered and lost. But then, a new vision appeared, a vision of hope. He saw himself standing at the center of the village, his hands glowing with the tree's light. The women gathered around him, their faces filled with joy and relief. The tree was alive, its branches stretching high into the sky, its light shining brighter than ever before. The visions faded, and the man found himself back in the clearing, his hands still pressed against the tree. The women's song had stopped, and the air was thick with silence. He turned to look at them, his mind reeling from what he had seen. They watched him with wide eyes, their expressions filled with awe and anticipation. The lead woman stepped forward, her hand outstretched. She placed it over his heart, her touch warm and reassuring. Then she pointed to the tree and spoke, her voice soft but filled with conviction. He didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. Her message was clear, he was the key to their survival. He was the one who could restore the tree's light and bring hope back to their tribe. But how? He was just a man, lost and alone in a strange world. What could he possibly do to save them? The woman seemed to sense his doubts. She placed her hand on his chest again, her eyes locking onto his. "Believe," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Believe in yourself." Her words echoed in his mind, filling him with a strange sense of calm. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain, he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when they needed him. He took a deep breath and nodded. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. "I'll help you." The woman smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. She stepped back and gestured to the tree, her movements filled with reverence. The other women began to chant again, their voices rising in a powerful melody. The man turned to face the tree, his heart pounding in his chest. He placed his hand on its trunk once more, feeling the energy flowing through him. The ritual had begun. And there was no turning back. The moment his hand touched the tree, the world around him dissolved into a swirl of light and shadow. He felt himself being pulled into the tree, his body weightless, his mind adrift in a sea of sensations. The women's chanting faded into the background, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from within the tree itself. He closed his eyes, letting the energy flow through him, and when he opened them again, he was no longer in the village. He stood in a vast, open space, the ground beneath his feet glowing with the same symbols he had seen on the tree. The air was thick with a golden mist, and the sky above shimmered with colors he couldn't name. In the distance, he saw the tree, but it was different. It was taller, more majestic, its branches stretching high into the sky and its leaves glowing with a radiant light. This was the tree as it had once been, full of life and power. As he approached the tree, he noticed figures standing around it. They were the men of the tribe, tall and strong, their faces filled with determination. They placed their hands on the tree's trunk, their bodies glowing with the same energy that now coursed through him. He could feel their connection to the tree, their bond with it, and he understood that they were its guardians, its protectors. But then, something changed. The light around the tree began to dim, and the men's expressions turned to fear. A shadow crept into the space, dark and formless, spreading like a stain across the ground. The men tried to fight it, their hands glowing brighter as they channeled the tree's energy, but it was no use. The shadow consumed them, one by one, until they were gone, leaving only the women behind. The vision shifted, and he found himself back in the village, but it was different now. The tree was withered, its branches bare and its light faded. The women moved through the village, their faces filled with sorrow and determination. They placed their hands on the tree, their voices rising in a mournful song, but the tree remained lifeless. He could feel their despair, their hopelessness, and it weighed heavily on his heart. But then, a new vision appeared. He saw himself standing in the center of the village, his hands glowing with the tree's light. The women gathered around him, their faces filled with hope and joy. The tree began to change, its branches stretching toward the sky and its leaves glowing with a radiant light. The village came alive, the air filled with laughter and song. He could feel the energy flowing through him, connecting him to the tree, to the women, to the very heart of the tribe. The vision faded, and he found himself back in the clearing, his hands still pressed against the tree's trunk. The women's chanting had stopped, and the air was thick with silence. He turned to look at them, his mind reeling from what he had seen. They watched him with wide eyes, their expressions filled with awe and anticipation. The lead woman stepped forward, her hand outstretched. She placed it over his heart, her touch warm and reassuring. Then she pointed to the tree and spoke, her voice soft but filled with conviction. He didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. Her message was clear, he was the key to their survival. He was the one who could restore the tree's light and bring hope back to their tribe. But how? He was just a man, lost and alone in a strange world. What could he possibly do to save them? The woman seemed to sense his doubts. She placed her hand on his chest again, her eyes locking onto his. "Believe," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Believe in yourself." Her words echoed in his mind, filling him with a strange sense of calm. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain, he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when they needed him. He took a deep breath and nodded. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. "I'll help you." The woman smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. She stepped back and gestured to the tree, her movements filled with reverence. The other women began to chant again, their voices rising in a powerful melody. The man turned to face the tree, his heart pounding in his chest. He placed his hand on its trunk once more, feeling the energy flowing through him. The ritual had begun. And there was no turning back. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled light on the forest floor. The man stood at the edge of the village, his heart pounding as he prepared for his first task. The lead woman had explained it to him as best she could, using gestures and the glowing crystal to convey her message. He was to retrieve a sacred artifact from a dangerous part of the forest, a place the women called the Shadow Grove. It was a test, a way to prove his worth to the tribe and to the tree. The women had given him a small pouch filled with glowing crystals, a woven belt to carry it, and a staff carved with the same symbols he had seen on the tree. They had also dressed him in a lightweight tunic and boots made of soft, flexible material that allowed him to move quietly. He felt both prepared and utterly out of his depth. The lead woman placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and concern. She pointed to the path leading into the forest and then to the pouch of crystals. He understood, he was to follow the path and use the crystals to guide him. She stepped back, her hands clasped in front of her, and the other women began to chant softly, their voices a soothing melody that carried him forward. The forest was eerily quiet as he walked, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. The path was narrow and overgrown, but the glowing crystals in his pouch pulsed faintly, guiding him deeper into the woods. He could feel the energy of the forest around him, a living, breathing presence that seemed to watch his every move. After what felt like hours, the path began to change. The trees grew taller and thicker, their branches twisting together to form a dense canopy that blocked out the sun. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath his feet became soft and spongy. He had entered the Shadow Grove. The crystals in his pouch began to glow brighter, their light cutting through the gloom. He held one in his hand, using it to illuminate the path ahead. The forest here was different, darker, more menacing. The trees seemed to lean toward him, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. He could feel the weight of the shadows pressing down on him, a suffocating presence that made it hard to breathe. He pressed on, his grip tightening on the staff. The crystals guided him, their light growing brighter as he approached the artifact. But the deeper he went, the more he felt like he was being watched. The shadows seemed to move, shifting and swirling just out of the corner of his eye. He quickened his pace, his heart racing as the sense of danger grew. Finally, he reached a small clearing. In the center stood a stone pedestal, and on top of it was the artifact, a small, intricately carved box covered in glowing symbols. He approached it cautiously, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The crystals in his pouch pulsed with a steady rhythm, their light illuminating the box. As he reached for the box, a low growl echoed through the clearing. He froze, his hand hovering just inches from the artifact. The growl grew louder, and he turned to see a massive creature emerging from the shadows. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, a mix of wolf and shadow, its body sleek and muscular, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The creature lunged at him, its jaws snapping shut just inches from his face. He stumbled back, raising the staff to defend himself. The creature circled him, its movements quick and deliberate. He could feel its breath, hot and rancid, as it growled and snarled. He knew he couldn't outrun it. He had to fight. The creature lunged again, and this time he was ready. He swung the staff, the glowing symbols on its surface flaring to life as it connected with the creature's side. The creature howled in pain, retreating a few steps. But it wasn't enough to stop it. It lunged again, and again, forcing him to dodge and strike with everything he had. The battle was fierce, the creature's strength and speed pushing him to his limits. But he refused to give up. He thought of the women, of their hope and determination, and it gave him the strength to keep fighting. He swung the staff with all his might, the symbols glowing brighter with each strike. Finally, with one last, powerful blow, he struck the creature's head, and it let out a final, ear-piercing howl before collapsing into a pool of shadow. He stood there, breathing heavily, his body trembling with exhaustion. The clearing was silent once more, the shadows retreating as the light from the crystals grew brighter. He turned back to the pedestal and reached for the box, his fingers closing around it. The moment he touched it, he felt a surge of energy, a connection to something ancient and powerful. The box was warm in his hands, the symbols on its surface glowing faintly. He placed it in his pouch and turned to leave, the crystals guiding him back the way he had come. The journey back was easier, the forest seeming to welcome him now that he had proven himself. The shadows no longer felt menacing, and the air was filled with a sense of calm. When he finally emerged from the forest, the women were waiting for him. They rushed forward, their faces filled with relief and joy. The lead woman took the box from him, her hands trembling as she held it. She looked at him, her eyes shining with gratitude, and placed a hand on his chest. "You are one of us now," she said, her voice soft but filled with conviction. He nodded, his heart swelling with a sense of belonging. He had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. He had proven his worth. And now, he was ready to take the next step. The village was alive with celebration. The women gathered around the great tree, their voices rising in a joyful song as they welcomed the man back from his journey. The lead woman held the sacred artifact high, its glowing symbols casting a warm light over the clearing. The man stood at the center of it all, his heart swelling with a sense of pride and belonging. He had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. He had proven his worth. And now, he was one of them. The lead woman approached him, her eyes filled with gratitude. She placed a hand on his chest, over his heart, and spoke softly. He didn't understand the words, but he could feel the emotion behind them, thankfulness, respect, and something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. She gestured for him to follow her, and the other women fell in line behind them, their song filling the air. They led him to a small hut at the edge of the village, its walls made of woven branches and leaves. Inside, the air was warm and fragrant, filled with the scent of flowers and herbs. The lead woman gestured for him to sit, and he did, his body sinking into a soft pile of furs. She knelt in front of him, her hands glowing faintly as she began to tend to his wounds. He hadn't even realized he was hurt. The adrenaline of the battle had masked the pain, but now he could feel the bruises and cuts on his body. The woman's touch was gentle, her hands warm and soothing as she worked. He closed his eyes, letting the tension drain from his body. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt safe. When she was done, she sat back and studied him, her expression thoughtful. Then she reached into a pouch at her side and pulled out a small, glowing crystal. She placed it in his hand and closed his fingers around it. The moment his skin touched the crystal, he felt a jolt of energy, and his vision blurred. Images flashed before his eyes, the tribe's past, their struggles, their hopes for the future. But this time, the visions were different. They were more personal, more intimate. He saw the lead woman as a child, her eyes filled with wonder as she played in the forest. He saw her as a young woman, learning the ways of the tribe, her hands glowing with the tree's light. And he saw her now, her face filled with determination as she led her people through their darkest times. When the visions faded, he looked at her, his heart aching with a strange mix of emotions. He didn't know how to put it into words, but he felt a deep connection to her, a bond that went beyond words. She smiled, her eyes shining with understanding, and placed a hand on his chest. "You are not alone," she said, her voice soft but filled with conviction. He nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He had spent so much of his life feeling lost, disconnected, but now he felt like he had found a place where he belonged. A place where he was needed. A place where he was loved. The days that followed were filled with learning and growth. The women taught him their ways, their language, their customs. He learned how to channel the tree's energy, how to use the crystals to communicate, how to navigate the forest. But more than that, he learned about them, their hopes, their dreams, their fears. He learned about the lead woman, whose name was Lyra, and the bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. Lyra was unlike anyone he had ever met. She was strong and determined, but also kind and compassionate. She had a quiet strength that inspired him, a resilience that gave him hope. And as they spent more time together, he found himself opening up to her in ways he never had with anyone else. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the village was bathed in the soft glow of the crystals, Lyra took him to the great tree. They sat together at its base, their shoulders touching, their hands intertwined. The air was filled with the sound of the women's song, a haunting melody that seemed to echo through the forest. Lyra turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and vulnerability. "You are our hope," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you are also my hope." He felt his heart swell with emotion. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he would do whatever it took to protect her, to protect the tribe. He would face whatever challenges lay ahead, no matter how difficult or dangerous. He squeezed her hand, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I'm here. For you. For all of you." Lyra smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat there together, watching as the stars began to appear in the night sky. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt at peace. He had found a home, a family, a purpose. And he knew that no matter what happened, he would never be alone again. The peace of the village was shattered one evening by a sound that sent chills down the man's spine, a low, guttural roar that echoed through the forest. He was sitting with Lyra by the great tree, their hands intertwined, when the sound reached them. Lyra's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. She stood quickly, pulling him to his feet. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tense. Lyra didn't answer. Instead, she gestured for him to follow her as she ran toward the center of the village. The other women were already gathering there, their faces filled with fear and determination. The lead elder, a tall woman with silver hair and piercing eyes, stepped forward and began to speak in their language. The man couldn't understand the words, but the urgency in her voice was clear. Lyra turned to him, her expression grim. "The Shadow Tribe," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They have come." The man's heart sank. He had heard stories of the Shadow Tribe, a group of warriors who lived deep in the forest, their hearts consumed by darkness. They were said to be ruthless, merciless, and driven by a desire to destroy anything that stood in their way. The women had always spoken of them with fear, but he had never thought they would actually come to the village. The elder finished speaking, and the women sprang into action. They moved quickly, gathering weapons and supplies, their movements precise and deliberate. Lyra grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the great tree. "We must protect the heart," she said, her voice urgent. "If they take it, all is lost." He nodded, his mind racing. He had faced danger before, but this was different. This wasn't just about him, it was about the tribe, about Lyra, about everything they had built together. He couldn't let them down. They reached the tree, and Lyra placed her hand on its trunk, her eyes closing as she whispered a prayer. The man did the same, feeling the familiar surge of energy as the tree's light flowed through him. He could feel its power, its life, and he knew that he would do whatever it took to protect it. The sound of the Shadow Tribe grew louder, their roars and shouts echoing through the forest. The man turned to Lyra, his heart pounding in his chest. "What's the plan?" he asked. Lyra's eyes were filled with determination. "We fight," she said simply. "We protect the heart. No matter what." He nodded, his grip tightening on the staff he had been given. The women formed a circle around the tree, their hands glowing with the tree's light. The man stood beside Lyra, his heart racing as the first of the Shadow tribe emerged from the forest. They were unlike anything he had ever seen. Tall and muscular, their bodies covered in dark, swirling tattoos, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. They moved with a predatory grace, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. The man could feel the darkness radiating from them, a suffocating presence that made it hard to breathe. The leader of the Shadow tribe stepped forward, a massive figure with a scar running down his face. He raised his weapon, a curved blade that seemed to absorb the light around it, and let out a roar that sent a shiver down the man's spine. The battle began in an instant. The Shadow tribe charged, their weapons raised, their voices filled with rage. The women met them head-on, their hands glowing as they channeled the tree's energy. The man fought beside Lyra, his staff moving in quick, precise strikes as he defended the tree. The fight was fierce, the air filled with the clash of weapons and the cries of the wounded. The man could feel the darkness pressing in on him, threatening to overwhelm him, but he refused to give in. He thought of Lyra, of the tribe, of everything they had fought for, and it gave him the strength to keep going. Lyra was a force to be reckoned with, her movements fluid and precise as she fought off the attackers. The man stayed close to her, his staff deflecting blows and striking down anyone who came too close. But the Shadow tribe was relentless, their numbers seeming to grow with each passing moment. The man felt a surge of panic as he realized they were being overwhelmed. The women were strong, but they were outnumbered. He glanced at Lyra, her face filled with determination, and knew that they couldn't give up. They had to keep fighting, no matter what. Just as the situation seemed hopeless, a powerful surge of energy erupted from the great tree. The man turned to see the elder standing at its base, her hands raised high, her body glowing with a radiant light. The tree's symbols flared to life, their light spreading through the village like a wave. The Shadow tribe hesitated, their movements slowing as the light reached them. The man could feel the energy flowing through him, filling him with strength and resolve. He raised his staff, his voice joining the women's as they let out a powerful chant. The Shadow tribe faltered, their weapons dropping as they stumbled back. The light grew brighter, forcing them to retreat into the forest. The man watched as they disappeared into the shadows, their roars fading into the distance. The village fell silent, the only sound the soft hum of the tree's light. The man turned to Lyra, his body trembling with exhaustion. She looked at him, her eyes filled with relief and gratitude, and placed a hand on his chest. "We did it," she said, her voice soft but filled with conviction. He nodded, his heart swelling with pride. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. But he knew that this was only the beginning. The Shadow tribe would be back, and they would have to be ready. For now, though, they had won. And that was enough. The village was quiet in the aftermath of the battle. The women moved through the clearing, tending to the wounded and repairing the damage done by the Shadow tribe. The man sat by the great tree, his body aching and his mind racing. He had fought with everything he had, but the battle had left him with more questions than answers. Who were the Shadow tribe? Why had they attacked? And what was their connection to the tree? Lyra approached him, her face filled with concern. She sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "You fought bravely," she said, her voice soft. "We could not have done it without you." He nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. "Lyra," he said, his voice tense, "I need to know the truth. Who are they? Why did they come here?" Lyra hesitated, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and fear. She looked at the tree, its light flickering faintly, and let out a deep breath. "It is a long story," she said. "But you deserve to know." She stood and gestured for him to follow her. They walked to the edge of the village, where the forest was quiet and the air was filled with the scent of flowers. Lyra sat on a fallen log and motioned for him to join her. He did, his heart pounding as he waited for her to speak. The Shadow Tribe was not always our enemy, Lyra began, her voice low and filled with emotion. Long ago, they were part of our tribe. They were our brothers, our fathers, our sons. But something changed. The darkness that took them, it was not just a force of nature. It was a choice. The man frowned, his mind racing. What do you mean? Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with pain. The tree's light is powerful, but it is not infinite. It requires balance, light and dark, life and death. The men of our tribe were tasked with maintaining that balance. But over time, they grew greedy. They wanted more power, more control. They began to draw too much from the tree, upsetting the balance and allowing the darkness to take hold. The man felt a chill run down his spine. What happened to them? The darkness consumed them, Lyra said, her voice trembling. It twisted their hearts, turned them into something else. They became the Shadow Tribe, driven by a desire to destroy the tree and claim its power for themselves. They believe that if they can take the heart of the tree, they will become unstoppable. The man's mind raced as he processed her words. And the women? Why were you spared? Lyra's eyes filled with tears. We were not spared. We were left behind. The men thought we were weak, that we could not handle the tree's power. But they were wrong. We have kept the tree alive, protected it, even as the darkness threatened to consume us. But we cannot do it alone. We need you. The man felt a surge of emotion, anger, sadness, determination. He thought of the visions he had seen, of the men vanishing into the darkness, of the women left behind to pick up the pieces. He thought of Lyra, of her strength and resilience, and he knew that he couldn't let her down. What can I do? He asked, his voice steady. Lyra placed a hand on his chest, her touch warm and reassuring. You are the balance, she said. The tree chose you because you have the strength to stand between light and dark, to restore the balance that was lost. But it will not be easy. The Shadow Tribe will not stop until they have the heart of the tree. And if they succeed, all will be lost. The man nodded, his mind made up. I'll do whatever it takes, he said. I'll protect the tree. I'll protect you. Lyra smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. I know you will, she said. But there is more you need to know. She reached into a pouch at her side and pulled out a small, glowing crystal. She placed it in his hand and closed his fingers around it. The moment his skin touched the crystal, his vision blurred, and he was pulled into another vision. He saw the tree as it had once been, its light shining brightly, its branches stretching high into the sky. He saw the men of the tribe, their hands glowing as they channeled the tree's energy. But then, he saw the darkness creeping in, twisting their hearts, turning them into something else. He saw the women, left behind, their hands pressed against the tree as they prayed for a miracle. And then, he saw himself. He was standing at the center of the village, his hands glowing with the tree's light. The women gathered around him, their faces filled with hope and joy. The tree was alive, its light shining brighter than ever before. But the vision shifted, and he saw the Shadow Tribe, their eyes filled with rage as they charged toward the village. The battle was fierce, the air filled with the clash of weapons and the cries of the wounded. But in the end, the light prevailed, and the darkness was pushed back. The vision faded, and the man found himself back in the forest, the crystal still glowing in his hand. He looked at Lyra, his heart pounding in his chest. What does it mean? He asked. Lyra's eyes were filled with determination. It means that the choice is yours, she said. You can restore the balance, bring the light back to the tree. But it will not be easy. The Shadow Tribe will do everything in their power to stop you. And if they succeed, all will be lost. The man nodded, his mind made up. I'll do it, he said. I'll restore the balance. No matter what it takes. Lyra smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. She placed a hand on his chest, her touch warm and reassuring. "I know you will," she said. "But you will not be alone. We will fight with you, every step of the way." The man felt a surge of emotion, hope, determination, love. He had found a home, a family, a purpose. And he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with courage and resolve. The truth had been revealed. And now, it was time to act. The village was alive with tension as the man stood at the base of the great tree, his hands glowing with its radiant light. The women surrounded him, their faces filled with determination and hope. The Shadow Tribe was coming, their roars echoing through the forest, and the man knew that this would be the final battle. The fate of the tribe, the tree, and everything they had fought for rested on his shoulders. Lyra stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "Remember," she said, her voice steady, "you are the balance. The tree chose you for a reason. Trust in its light, and trust in yourself." He nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the tree's energy flowing through him, filling him with strength and resolve. He had come so far, faced so many challenges, and he wasn't about to give up now. He looked at Lyra, her eyes filled with love and determination, and he knew that he would do whatever it took to protect her, to protect the tribe. The Shadow Tribe emerged from the forest, their dark forms silhouetted against the fading light of the sun. They moved with a predatory grace, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. The man could feel the darkness radiating from them, a suffocating presence that threatened to overwhelm him. But he stood his ground, his hands glowing brighter as he channeled the tree's energy. The leader of the Shadow Tribe stepped forward, his eyes filled with rage. "You cannot stop us," he snarled, his voice low and menacing. "The tree's power will be ours." The man shook his head, his voice steady. "The tree's power belongs to no one," he said. "It is a force of balance, of life. And I will not let you destroy it." The leader let out a roar and charged, his weapon raised. The man met him head-on, his hands glowing as he deflected the blow. The battle began in an instant, the air filled with the clash of weapons and the cries of the wounded. The women fought beside him, their hands glowing as they channeled the tree's energy. The man could feel their strength, their determination, and it gave him the courage to keep fighting. The fight was fierce, the Shadow Tribe's darkness clashing with the tree's light. The man moved with precision, his strikes quick and deliberate as he defended the tree. But the Shadow Tribe was relentless, their numbers seeming to grow with each passing moment. The man felt a surge of panic as he realized they were being overwhelmed. Just as the situation seemed hopeless, the man felt a powerful surge of energy erupt from the tree. He turned to see Lyra standing at its base, her hands raised high, her body glowing with a radiant light. The tree's symbols flared to life, their light spreading through the village like a wave. The Shadow Tribe hesitated, their movements slowing as the light reached them. The man could feel the energy flowing through him, filling him with strength and resolve. He raised his hands, his voice joining the women's as they let out a powerful chant. The light grew brighter, forcing the Shadow Tribe to retreat. The man watched as they disappeared into the forest, their roars fading into the distance. The village fell silent, the only sound the soft hum of the tree's light. The man turned to Lyra, his body trembling with exhaustion. She looked at him, her eyes filled with relief and gratitude, and placed a hand on his chest. "You did it," she said, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "You restored the balance." He nodded, his heart swelling with pride. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. But he knew that this was only the beginning. The tree's light was strong, but it would require constant care and protection. And he was ready to take on that responsibility. The days that followed were filled with healing and rebuilding. The women worked together to repair the damage done by the Shadow Tribe, their spirits lifted by the victory. The man spent his days by the tree, learning its secrets and strengthening his connection to its light. Lyra was always by his side, her presence a constant source of comfort and strength. As the village began to thrive once more, the man felt a deep sense of belonging. He had found a home, a family, a purpose. And he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with courage and resolve. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the village was bathed in the soft glow of the tree's light, the man stood with Lyra at the base of the great tree. They watched as the women gathered around it, their voices rising in a joyful song. The man felt a surge of emotion, pride, gratitude, love. Lyra turned to him, her eyes filled with warmth. "You have given us hope," she said. "You have given us a future." He smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. "And you have given me a home," he said. "A family. A purpose." Lyra placed a hand on his chest, her touch warm and reassuring. "You are one of us now," she said. "And we will always be with you." The man nodded, his eyes filled with determination. He had come so far, faced so many challenges, and he knew that there would be more to come. But he was ready. He had found his place in the world, and he would do whatever it took to protect it. As the women's song filled the air, the man felt a deep sense of peace. He had restored the balance, brought the light back to the tree, and found a family in the process. And he knew that no matter what the future held, he would face it with courage, love, and hope. The legacy of the tribe, of the tree, and of the man who had saved them would live on, a testament to the power of balance, of light, and of the human spirit.